Welcome to the Primitive Lifeways channel. In today's video, I want to show you how to make a projectile point out of a local stone called Argillite. So stick around, I'll be right back with you. Back. Now, as you can see, I've been kind of working off camera here. I have a large grinding slick, and then I have warm water in a ceramic vessel that I made about a year and a half ago, and you can see how cold it is outside because from the warm water there's steam that's rising and releasing from the surface. But I keep this grinding slick pretty wet and saturated. That prevents dust. You don't want this stuff to get into your lungs, and it keeps everything clean. And the way that I can explain this process is it's much like flint knapping obsidian, chert, rhyolite, dacite, so forth and so on, where you're removing the high spots and you're thinning the piece out. So that's exactly what I'm doing, just in a different way. So I soak the stone, run a bit of water on the surface, and I grind it down. So you can see my primary focus is along this edge right here, because that's definitely higher than this side. So I'll just remove right up in this area. And once I have that removed and it looks somewhat symmetrical, then I move on to the next part. So it's important to keep observing the stone and just seeing what part you need to thin out. So as I continue on, I observe the stone, and you can see that I removed some of that high spot up in here. So then I'll flip it over and I'll look at what I need to remove next. So you can see that there's a slight taper towards the bottom, and then up top in this area there's a high spot. So that's what I want to work on and flatten out. So I just tilt the stone on this grinding slick and I'll remove material. And this is really how you work all Argillite, whether you're making a projectile point or an ornament. It's the same principle. All right, so as you can see, this piece is quite thin and it's flat on both sides. So I got a little bit more thinning to do in order for this to be complete. But at this stage, I want to shape it out into a triangle, so the shape of a projectile point. And I'll just continue on with the same grinding slick, and I'm just removing the edges at this point. So I just grind the material down on one edge, and then I flip it around and do the same thing. So most of the examples of Argillite projectile points that I've seen are definitely historical. I've only seen one prehistoric example, and that object is questionable. The reason I say it's questionable is because there was a hole drilled through the piece, and that tells me that it was most likely used as an ornamental, either around the neck, around a body part. That I'm not sure. It's a very gorgeous piece. It's heavily serrated, and it looks to be very sharp. But as far as its context, like I said, I believe that it was used as more of an ornamental piece, not for hunting. You can see we're getting a really nice shape here. So here's where I'm at. You can see we have a nice shape. And at this point, I'll thin it out and I'll create a taper along the sides. So once again, I'll just work both sides of the stone. And at this point, I want to really slow down. You don't want to get this thing too thin. But being this is a very rough abrasive stone, the Argillite could chip. So I just go slow and I constantly check the progress. Now, as this thing gets even thinner, I'll change over to a finer grit sandstone. And actually, it probably wouldn't be bad to switch over right now. But still, even with this finer grit, you have to go slow because you can remove too much too fast with such a soft stone. But yeah, things are looking good. I'm liking the shape. It's nice and even, nice and symmetrical. It's gonna make a cool point. And here we are. You can see we created a taper along the edges at the base, and this thing is very sharp at the tip. So now we'll finish this projectile point off by creating notches on the side, and then we can mount this onto an arrow shaft. Now when I notch this Argillite, I mark out where the notches will go. And then I have another stone projectile point that I made to actually carve into the stone. So this has mild serrations on it, and I just pull back on the point, and you'll slowly carve in these notches. So the serrations definitely help bite into the Argillite. It's like a small file. Now the nice thing about using a stone projectile point, well at least the ones that I make, I create a slight taper from the base of the point where the foreshaft mounts onto and it's glued on to the tip. And not only does that help when hunting game, because that needle tip really helps penetrate through the hide of the animal, it gets into these tight confined spaces quite well without widening up the initial cut of this notch. So I find it, again, quite useful, and that's what I recommend using when making these style points. It's just a stone point, like I said, that has a taper towards a tip, as you can see. And man, this thing is still wicked. I did knock off the tip when cutting this notch, but that's okay. I can get in there with my copper pressure flaker and we can sharpen this up with no problem. So here's the projectile point completed. You can see the size compared to a penny. So it's really not that big, but this thing will absolutely kill with the right bow. So at this point, I'll mount it onto an arrow shaft and I'll show you how well it performs. Give me a couple days and I'll be right back with you on part 2.